Velvet Note's a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your very own living room. What we try to do here is bring down the wall that often exists between artists and audiences. We give you a chance to get to know the artist. You're always guaranteed a chance to meet the artist. And we also want you to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. We have the best jazz performers in the world who perform here. Grammy winners, people who are legends in the jazz field. And all you have to do is go right down the street. Here, you're able to see them, and they're right in front of you. They're an arm's length away from you. It's like they're performing a private concert for you and the people you love. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Hi, I'm Carla Harris. As a performer and as a listener who has enjoyed some incredible shows at the Velvet Note over the years, I've often been struck by how, when people are inside those walls, the issues of the world outside just fall away, and the connection between everyone inside is heightened. To me, that is the power and the magic and the beauty of the live music experience. And it's why I hope that as you enjoy the encore concerts that the Velvet Note is streaming each weekend, that, if you are able, that you would click the donate button that you see somewhere on your screen, because when you do, you'll help the Velvet Note make it through this tough time and be there when we can gather again and feel that magic. So thanks for helping Tamara keep the stage lights and the twinkle lights on. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the music.
All we need is love and music, and a little chocolate now and then doesn't hurt. Please help us bring these performances into your home without charging a fee. Donate at thevelvetnote.com. Donate. Hi, I'm Tamara Fuller, owner of the Velvet Note, and we welcome you to another magical evening of music in our virtual club. Before we get started, let me introduce the band. Nick Rosen's calling for music began very young when he was plucking out tunes at the piano. Over the years, he's toured with Russell Gunn, Dion Ferris, Colonel Bruce Hampton, Liz Brasher, and the Magpie Salute. In early 2018, he joined the Shadowboxers on their tour opening for Justin Timberlake. Nick has accompanied legends such as Jennifer Holliday, Roy Ayers, and Nathan East, and has appeared on albums by Curtis Fuller, soul artists Donnie and Julie Dexter, as well as newcomers like Faye Webster. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Jazz Studies from Florida State University, where his seminal piano instructors were Bill Peterson and Marcus Roberts. In early 2015, his album Step Into the Light was released on Rope-A-Dope Records. The album features artists Oteil Burbridge, Saunders Sermons, Terrion Gully, and Daryl Reeves. John Sanford is a jazz tenor saxophonist who has landed in Atlanta, Georgia after spending portions of his career in Chicago, Illinois, Long Island, New York, and Buffalo, New York. After receiving his degree from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, John was an active presence on the Chicago music scene, performing with many of Chicago's great jazz musicians, including George Flutis, Jody Christian, Jeff Parker, and many others. While in Chicago, he became a member of the critically acclaimed Sony recording artist Mighty Blue Kings, appearing on the Mighty Blue Kings Sony release live from Chicago, as well as the independent releases, a Christmas album, and a Live in the City. With Mighty Blue Kings, John has toured extensively in the United States and Europe, sharing bills with B.B. King, Ray Charles, Diana Krall, Tony Bennett, Buddy Guy, and many others. Kevin Smith was exposed to music at a young age, growing up in some of Atlanta's historical black Baptist churches. Being exposed to the culture's hymnody, Negro spirituals, country blues, and gospel music would set the foundation for a successful music career. In his senior year of high school, he won his Grammy Award for his project with local hip-hop group Outkast. After finishing high school, Kevin was accepted into Florida State University and received a scholarship to be placed in the School of Music's string performance program. Here, he studied classical Baroque contrabass with Melanie Punter from the Orchestra of St. Luke's and Atlanta Baroque Orchestra, and was under the direction of Maestro Dr. Alex Jimenez from the University Symphony. He was also accepted into the Jazz Studies departments, where he studied jazz bass with Rodney Jordan. He also studied and performed with department head Leon Anderson Jr., Marcus Roberts, Wynton Marsalis, Scotty Barnhart from the Count Basie Orchestra and the Duke Ellington Orchestra, Inga Swearengin, and Dr. John Parks. Kevin also held a chair in the Tallahassee Symphony Orchestra and has played in the Columbus Symphony, Albany Symphony, and Dothan Opera orchestras. Born in Jacksonville, Florida, Justin Varnes began studying music at 10 on the trumpet. His father, an avid jazz listener, exposed him to Stan Kenton, Nat King Cole, and Errol Garner. After attending Douglas Anderson School of the Arts on trumpet, Justin then switched to the drum set and studied music at the University of North Florida, where he graduated with degrees in jazz studies and percussion. Justin relocated to New York City, where he continued to study at the New School and studied privately with Jojo Mayer. In New York, Justin began touring with Phoebe Snow, with whom he performed on the Roseanne Barr Show, as well as National Public Radio's World Cafe, where he would later perform with the pop music band Five for Fighting. Justin is currently a music teacher at the prestigious Lovett School, music director for the Velvet Note, and founder of the acclaimed online drummers resource and the Legends of Jazz series in its 7th season.
Yes. I'm surprised that you guys are here. I thought you would be out at your vacation homes by now. When do you leave? Okay, well, if you're on a staycation, this is the perfect place to be. Yeah. The Velvet Note is a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your living room. And we give you a chance to get to know the musicians, but also to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. But I want to make mention of the fact that this is the last, this year, of a series that we've been doing called Legends of Jazz. And it gives you a chance to get to hear a performance of a legendary jazz artist played by great musicians. And also kind of interspersed with that, you get a little bit of a jazz history or jazz appreciation lesson. So if this is your first time here, thank you so much for trying us out, and we hope that you'll enjoy this. If this is a subscriber series for you, thank you so much for being one of our loyal subscribers. And we're so happy to have you for the music of Joe Henderson. Before we get started tonight, I wanted to tell you a little story. I don't usually have much to say about the artist because Justin's going to do that, but a few weeks ago, I was sitting here in the Velvet Note doing my administrative work that I do 8, 9, 10 hours a day. And I get a call from a guy who says, you know, we sell POS systems. We'd like to come and pitch you a POS system. I said, well, we already have a POS system. Sorry, good luck with that. And he said, well, we do sell POS systems, though, to places like Blues Alley and other jazz clubs. And I thought, since you're a jazz club, you might be interested. I said, well, I've got a great POS system. I'm still not interested, but that's really interesting that you are selling to jazz clubs. I said, who are you? And he said, well, I used to be Joe Henderson's drummer. I said, and now you're selling POS systems. Huh. I said, well, that's fascinating. We have a tribute to Joe Henderson coming up. I said, what can you tell me about Joe Henderson? He said, well, I only worked with Joe Henderson for a year, but here's what I can tell you that is I've never seen since. He said when Joe Henderson would get into the studio to record a track, he'd be looking at sheet music that he hadn't seen before. And the rest of us would be like ready to rehearse and lay it down. And he would glance at the sheet music really quickly. And then he would stand there with his saxophone and he would just move his fingers slightly over the keys for 1 minute. And then he'd go outside and he'd smoke a cigarette for 3 minutes. And then he'd come back in and he'd move his fingers over the keys for 1 minute. And then he'd go back outside and smoke a cigarette for 3 minutes. And when he came back in, he would lay that sucker down on the first track. I said, wow, that is genius. I hope that you watch the live stream for the Velvet Notes tribute to the music of Joe Henderson done by the Justin Varnes Quartet. Give it up!
Back there gabbing, and that's why she has to yell my name so loud so people know to shut up and play. Speaking of which. guys so much. Before we go further, please help me thank Mr. John Sanford on the tenor saxophone. Mr. Nick Rosen on the piano. And Mr. Kevin Smith on the bass. We opened up with a tune not written by Joe Henderson, but one that comes from one of my favorite albums that he did. The tune is entitled Four, written by Miles Davis, and one of my early introductions to Joe Henderson was this album. It's an album he did entitled Four with Miles Davis's rhythm section, basically, in 1964. It's a live album, and that was the one where my ear at least first caught Joe Henderson, so that I've always kind of connected that tune with Joe. But we're going to talk a lot about Joe's sound and influences, but Joe was just a phenomenal composer, a jazz composer. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about his compositions, even though that wasn't one of them. He was born in Lima, Ohio, and grew up there and studied in his local high school, took some piano lessons, and when he got into his jazz band, they actually didn't have a whole lot of music prepared, so Joe would write tunes for his jazz band while he was in high school, which kind of got his compositional chops rolling, if you will. Then after he graduated high school, he moved to the Detroit area to start getting into the jazz scene there, but also to attend college. He actually attended a couple of colleges there, but the main one he attended was Wayne State University. And while he was there, he happened to be classmates with three other famous jazz musicians, or at least who would go on to become famous jazz musicians. One was the great trumpeter Donald Byrd, another was the great pianist Barry Harris, and then also the great saxophonist Yusef Lateef. So they all happened to just be at Wayne State University at the same time, which I'm sure did a lot to help promote and grow Joe's expansive sounds and concept, because Joe's earliest influences were Lester Young on the saxophone and Charlie Parker. Those two saxophonists probably have influenced more other jazz saxophone players than anyone, the combination of those two guys. But here is Joe Henderson being one of those, influenced by those. He was also heavily influenced by Dexter Gordon, and would listen a lot to Lee Konitz. He was also a huge fan of Norman Granz's Jazz at the Philharmonic. He would listen to that stuff on the radio a lot as a kid. So he's kind of really well versed in like the classic bebop and hard bop styles. He becomes a hard bop player, but he's versed in like classic swing and classic bebop styles. But when he gets to Detroit and Wayne State, he starts to hear these kind of more modern and more kind of outstretched concepts. And this had a profound influence on what will eventually become his style. But this is going to take a minute, because once he gets out of Wayne State, he gets inducted into the Army. And so he spends 2 years in the Army. This is basically 2 years. 1960, 1961. He spent, and actually he did his first stop in the Army. He did down the street, down at Fort Benning base. So not too far from Atlanta. And then while he was in the Army, he did some traveling. A very different Army experience. We've talked about Army a couple of times over this last stretch of gigs. One was the awful experience that Lester Young had in the military. And then we talked about Dave Brubeck and how Dave basically was on the front line and got to create a jazz band up there. It's interesting to watch kind of how the color barrier broke and how differently somebody like Joe Henderson was treated in his time in the Army, largely as a result of the sacrifices that people like Lester Young made and Dave Brubeck made to kind of get things changed. So we had a much better experience in the Army here in the early 60s. So he would travel with the Army, and while he was over in Paris, he got a chance to go to some local jam sessions, and he got to play with two famous jazz musicians. One is the pianist Kenny Drew, and the other is another Kenny, a great drummer named Kenny Clark. And this was the early 60s, and Kenny Drew and Kenny Clark were a handful of the musicians who had lived in the United States for quite a while, but then found new homes over in Europe where jazz musicians, at least at that time, were treated a lot better. They had a lot more gigs, and they just wanted to kind of live overseas where they felt more respected. So Joe got a chance to play with those guys and was really heavily influenced by them. So when he comes back and he gets out of the Army in 1962, he immediately heads to New York City, and he's there at a jam session led by saxophonist Junior Cook. While he's there, he meets a young trumpet player by the name of Kenny Dorham. And Kenny and Joe would go on to make just tons and tons of albums together, which we're going to talk about later. But almost right when Joe got to New York, he not only got to meet Kenny Dorham, who would kind of be his longtime partner musically, but also that same night they went out to check out Dexter Gordon, one of his heroes at Birdland, and Dexter actually allowed Joe to come up and play with the band. So he had a very quick introduction to New York City, and just from that very early success, Blue Note Records signed him. And although he was starting to tour with the great Horace Silver, as a matter of fact, when we talked about Horace a couple months ago, his famous song for My Father, it's a very young Joe Henderson who plays the famous saxophone solo on Song for My Father. So Joe starts to really kind of get deeply rooted into the hard bop scene that was going on at the time. And so Joe's first record, he wrote a song that perfectly fits that hard bop style that we're going to play for you right now. This is a classic, probably one of his most well-known compositions. This is entitled Recordame. For those of you who have been here for Horace Silver and some of those other kind of hard bop icons that we focused on, that composition of Joe's fits all of those categories. It's got some Brazilian rhythmic influence. It's got a little bit more of a groove aspect to it. Melody is fairly simple, in terms of being able to kind of sing along with it. It's kind of a toe tapper. All those things fit really nicely into that kind of hard bop box, if you will. And again, he's in the middle of touring with the great Horace Silver. And in some respects, what's happening in Joe's career can be paralleled to one of his contemporaries, which is the great saxophonist Wayne Shorter. Wayne also kind of grew up. This is after the swing and the bebop eras when jazz kind of had a foothold in American culture. This is after that fact, and although both of these musicians are rooted in that style, when they start to come up, they get schooled under the tutelage of a Horace Silver or in the case of Wayne Shorter, Art Blakey. And of course, Art Blakey and Horace Silver played together for a number of years, and they really helped define that hard bop style. But just like Wayne Shorter, who eventually went on to create his own stamp on the music, the same thing happened with Joe, and it happened fairly quickly. He was fully enjoying his time with Horace Silver. He was also starting to make a lot of records with his buddy Kenny Dorham, and he was becoming kind of the hot saxophone player on Blue Note Records, which at the time, in the early to mid '60s, was the place to record for a jazz musician. So he's on a ton of famous jazz records. He's on a couple of Herbie Hancock records and Donald Byrd and all these great musicians, but he's trying to carve out his own sound and his own name, if you will. So he's going to take this hard bop sound that he was getting into, but also take some of these newer sounds, these newer influences, and twist this hard bop sound into kind of his own unique pattern. And one of the things that grew out of this compositionally was his stuff is still going to be a lot of like medium swing, you can tap your foot to it kind of stuff. So he didn't go out in the way that maybe a Cecil Taylor or a Ornette Coleman or somebody like that who stretched the music. He kept the swing feel and the toe tapping part from his hard bop days intact. But what he did instead was he changed the forms of some of the songs. Instead of everything kind of being the same structure, a lot of jazz follows a similar structure that you might find in a church hymn or a Broadway show, and everything has 4 and 8 bar phrases, and the form itself is fairly repetitive so that everyone can kind of latch onto it easily. Well, he sought to kind of break that mold. So in his later compositions, you're going to hear all that hard boppy stuff, but the form isn't going to be so clear cut. It's going to be more interesting. It'll draw you in a little bit more. But also, his melodies, although they're going to be ear-catching, are going to have some twists and turns in it. Like lots of little hits and stuff in the rhythm section. So he's going to take a lot from that hard bop sound and really try and push the boundaries. So we're going to do a couple compositions for you right now that he put on a couple of his more famous records that he recorded in 1964. The first one is a tune entitled Punjab, and it's off a record he did called In and Out. And then we're going to do another track off of a record entitled Inner Urge. We're going to do the title track from that record. And you're going to hear it's got that toe-tapping quality, but listen how it's going to, lots of little twists and turns in there as well. So here comes Punjab and Inner Urge back to back. Thank you, guys.
The Velvet Note's a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your very own living room. What we try to do here is bring down the wall that often exists between artists and audiences. We give you a chance to get to know the artist. You're always guaranteed a chance to meet the artist. And we also want you to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. We have the best jazz performers in the world who perform here. Grammy winners, people who are legends in the jazz field. And all you have to do is go right down the street. Here, you're able to see them, and they're right in front of you. They're an arm's length away from you. It's like they're performing a private concert for you and the people you love. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Those tunes are a lot of fun to play, but they make us sweat. So, yeah. Things just got serious over there at the piano chair. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Yes, thank you. Yes. Security. So yeah, you can hear that in his composition. It still sounds like that kind of hard bop thing. It's it's still swing based. It's in 4/4. It's easy to kind of tap your foot to. But there's lots of other interesting and cool things going on, which really did help evolve and develop the jazz language in the early to mid '60s. And some of the things that were happening, like for example, on that last tune entitled "Inner Urge," and it was both the saxophonist and the bassist have the melody there. And the piano and drums are kind of playing hits behind them, and things like that were starting to become part of the evolution of jazz in the 60s, where as the jazz in the 30s and 40s and 50s a lot were mainly based around having a soloist out front, and they're basically 99% of the feature with a rhythm section behind them, basically just kind of doing God's work behind them while they solo and take all the applause and we bow and all that sort of stuff. The good old days, John calls that. But Joe had a large hand, as did Horace Silver and Wayne Shorter, some of these, and John Coltrane. A lot of these great musicians from the '60s. They really tried to make it more of a group effort where everyone in the band had a role and was more heavily involved in the composition. And we got to see some of that get featured in those last couple of tunes. So these records were done in the mid '60s, and so as we start to move into the late '60s, 1967, 1968, 1969, well, the entire course of jazz starts to change. In particular, maybe the lightning rod of that would have been Miles Davis, when in the late '60s, he started moving toward electric instruments and into the fusion era. And so a lot of these hard bop musicians and bebop musicians from the 50s and 60s, if they didn't catch a piece of that train, that good old-fashioned like hard bop and classic swing and bebop stuff that jazz was enjoyed for several decades, that started to become less and less popular. And so, and this is part of why some musicians like Dexter Gordon and Kenny Clark and Kenny Drew, some of these people moved over to Europe because it was still popular there in the 60s and well into the 70s. So Joe kind of hit this crossroads in the mid to late 60s where he, this cool style that he had developed, it wasn't quite as in demand now that fusion hit. So he did actually have a short stint with Miles, with Miles Davis's second great quintet, including Wayne Shorter, his contemporary. Joe played with them for just a little bit, and it actually wasn't recorded. But he did that, and then actually for a while he played saxophone with the great funk and rock band Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So he found some work there and kind of started to get into that aspect. Also, as I said before, was working some with Herbie Hancock. But the reality is that style of like classic blue note hard bop sound that he made his name on was becoming less and less popular. So in the 70s, he wasn't making records that were as popular as before, and he started to try to look for other avenues. He moved to San Francisco. This is in the early 80s now. He moved to San Francisco and started teaching some as well as playing. He was playing, but in the early to mid 60s, he was the man. He was playing all over the place. But just the landscape of jazz changed the way that it did, and Joe wasn't one of those guys. For example, his contemporary, Wayne Shorter. Well, when that whole fusion thing happened, what did Wayne do? If you guys remember from a couple months ago, Wayne joined the band or helped form the band Weather Report, which is completely in that fusion style. So Wayne hopped on that fusion train early, got himself a band, and was really able to prosper. Joe Henderson really didn't take that path. So for much of the 70s and into the early 80s, Joe was still playing, well respected, and that sort of stuff, but he wasn't, at the top of the food chain in the jazz world, if you will. And then something interesting happened in the late 70s. This is 1976, 1977, when one of his heroes, Dexter Gordon, came back from Paris and played at the Village Vanguard. And this is 1977, I think it was. And he played the Village Vanguard, and they recorded it. And I don't think anyone saw this coming. But when Dexter came back into town and had a stretch of gigs at the Village Vanguard, there were lines around the corner. Everyone freaked out that Dexter Gordon was back, and essentially it signaled this renaissance, we miss that classic hard bop and bebop sound that had kind of long since been pushed to the wayside. And so it was that record, Dexter Gordon's Homecoming is the title of the record. And if you listen to it, it's a live record, and the crowd is going nuts. And they're mostly younger audience members. So this isn't necessarily guys from Dexter's heyday coming back out to see old Dexter Gordon. These are younger these are younger ears who are yearning for that sound. And that slowly but surely, literally 10 years later, it basically put this wheel into motion that they asked, Blue Note asked to get back together with Joe Henderson, and they did a record at the Village Vanguard. This is in 1986, to essentially connect him with Dexter Gordon and get the whole thing. So we have another tenor saxophone player. He's kind of resurfacing. We're going to have him at the Village Vanguard, just like he did with Dexter Gordon. And he released a trio record. It's entitled State of the Tenor, live at the Village Vanguard. And this was the beginning of what would be basically a second career or a renaissance for Mr. Henderson. So we're going to do a tune off of that record. I believe it's the first track off the record. It's a great tune written by a contemporary of his, great tenor saxophonist, Mr. Sam Rivers. It was written for his wife, named after her. It's a beautiful tune entitled Beatrice.
Kevin was saying something to me, and I'm pretty sure he probably told me I was wrong about something I said, so I had to hear about this after he said. I don't know what he said. Here we go.
Thank you guys very much. Sam Rivers, Beatrice. So that was off of, again, a record from 1986, I think it was, live at the Village Vanguard, State of the Tenor. And it was designed to kind of, kickstart Joe's part of the renaissance that was starting to happen in jazz in the mid-'80s. But it didn't quite go over initially as well as Blue Note and Joe had hoped. So it didn't just immediately catapult him back into the consciousness, if you will. So he went for a couple more years, did a couple more records, some stuff overseas, etc. And a record label that was really prominent in the 50s, which had basically folded away into another record label once jazz wasn't popular enough to make a profit. And this record label kind of resurfaced under one of the bigger major labels, and that's the record label called Verve. And Verve, from the 50s, was probably the mastermind behind what was happening in the success on the jazz side of Verve from the 50s was Norman Granz, the one who produced all those great Jazz at the Philharmonic records, which obviously heavily influenced Joe. So when Verve kind of kicked things back up in the late 80s and early 90s, they reached out to Joe and said, hey, what do you think about hopping on our label and let's kind of do that Jazz at the Philharmonic thing with you, where we take different artists, like different songbooks. For example, if you go get the Ella Fitzgerald sings the Cole Porter songbook, or Ella Fitzgerald sings the Duke Ellington songbook. Those were hugely successful records, and all of that was put together by Norman Granz. He liked the idea of taking an artist, performing artist, and pairing them with one of the great composers. And it really caught on. It was really popular in the 50s. So they basically unearthed this, or I should say revived this concept with Joe Henderson. And the first record they did, which is in 1992 with Joe. This is a record called Lush Life, the music of Billy Strayhorn. And this was the first of these records where they paired Joe with a great composer. And this record blew up. This is what Blue Note was trying to do with State of the Tenor. It was called Lush Life, and it happened in 1992. And by this time, the renaissance of jazz was kind of in full swing. And the jazz audience, America, even if you will, was ready for it. And so this record blew up, and this really did catapult Joe back into the popular jazz canon, if you will. So we're going to take a second now and feature John and Kevin on a duet version of a great Billy Strayhorn tune entitled Isfahan, and they're going to do it in the style that Joe Henderson did it on this record, Lush Life. One of the interesting things about this record, as I mentioned, is kind of part of that whole renaissance of jazz. The players on the record, the bass player at the time, Christian McBride, was 17 years old. The drummer, the drummer, Greg Hutchinson, I think was 18 or 19. The pianist on the record, Stephen Scott, was I think 20 or 21. And Joe said that the old man on the session was this old dude named Wynton Marsalis, who was all of 30. So he got this super young rhythm section, great players at such an early age. It was just a great combination. And from that alliance, Wynton started using Joe Henderson on a lot of his own records, and so really not only was it this Verve record that got things going, but he also paired up a lot with Wynton Marsalis, who was basically at the forefront of this new movement. So we're going to do a tune right now entitled Isfahan, which is in the style of that great Joe Henderson record entitled Lush Life. Sanford, Kevin Smith. So, like I said, that was the beginning of a long run of records that he did with Verve, where he was paired with great composers, had kind of cool bands put together around him. He did one for Antonio Carlos Jobim. He did the music of Porgy and Bess. And actually, while he was on that record label, I mentioned before that he and trumpet player Kenny Dorham were longtime partners on a lot of Kenny's records. Joe's playing saxophone on a lot of Joe's records. Kenny's playing saxophone. I'm sorry, Kenny's not playing saxophone. Kenny's playing the trumpet. That would be a whole other record. But they actually had, Joe had a big band together in the early to mid 60s with Kenny Dorham. And they had a whole bunch of tunes written and toured around a bunch of that, but they actually never recorded the music. And Verve basically brought those old arrangements back, and so there's a couple of Joe Henderson big band records that were released in the 90s, mid to late 90s, like 1996, 97, that sort of era. But most of those arrangements are from Joe's original big band with Kenny back in the 60s. So those are kind of cool records to check out. So we're going to close the evening with a tune off of another one of these songbook albums that he did. The album is entitled So Near, So Far, The Musings of Miles. And there are a bunch of tunes either that Miles wrote or Miles was famous for. And again, it's another pairing of other musicians. And they were all Miles Davis alumni. There was John Schofield on guitar, Dave Holland on bass, and Al Foster on drums. So we're going to play a tune off of that record, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But before I do, I want to say this isn't the end of the series. We have two more going into next year. But me and the guys were in between sound check and the gig, just talking about what a great run this has been. And we cannot thank you guys enough for showing up and supporting us and allowing us to do this. So from us, please. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for coming out and supporting this. We really appreciate it. We also appreciate the opportunity to have a night where we're not playing Christmas music this time of year. Although I won't speak for them, I love Christmas. Yeah, I love Christmas music. But by about December 23rd, I've played Linus and Lucy about 700 times. So. Yeah, so we can do Baby It's Cold Outside. Sure. Yeah. Please, give me more hot water. That's what I need. Turn the heat up on the water. Thank you. But before we play this last tune, please help me thank Mr. John Sanford on the tenor saxophone. Nick Rosen on the piano. Kevin Smith on the bass. This last tune was performed for many years by Miles Davis, and it's a particularly difficult tune to play. The form, the structure of the song is irregular. It's not a form that most jazz musicians are comfortable with. And there are even some, most of the song is in regular 4/4 like most music is in, but then there's these random times where it switches time signatures. It's got a whole mess of stuff in it, and most jazz musicians kind of shy away from it because of how difficult it is. But of course, Joe Henderson took right to it because it matches his style of writing, where he enjoys taking something that's regularly swing and using that same jazz language and vocabulary that we all love, but putting some little twists and turns on it. So if you get a chance, check out the record, Musings of Miles. He just dominates this cut. Sorry, John, good luck. You're gonna see a lot of John shaking his head like, what was that? So, but it's a great tune by Victor Feldman entitled Joshua. So thank you guys so much.
That was the tempo. I wasn't snapping at him. I'm still alive.
No, I crossed myself.
Thank you guys so much. The music of Joe Henderson, John Sanford, Nick Rosen, Kevin Smith. My name is Justin Varnes. Hope you guys have a happy holidays, a great new year. Thanks again for joining us.